Hello there, I'm Miranda and this is Take a Moment with NCH&C, the show where we talk to you and your colleagues about experiences that affect you. Listen on your drive between patients or in your downtime, whenever you get the chance to take a moment.
In this episode, I talk to Mark Rowlands and Vicky Aspinall about domestic abuse. If you're affected by any of the topics discussed in this episode, you can contact the safeguarding team or take a look at the podcast episode notes for links to further support resources.
Hi, I'm Vicky Aspinall, Deputy Named Nurse for Safeguarding Children at NCH&C, as well as Domestic Abuse Lead for the organisation.
Hi, I'm Mark Rowlands. I'm one of the deputies for Safeguarding Adults, and I'm one of the domestic abuse champions.
Thank you both for joining me on the podcast today. So when we say the words domestic abuse, a few things do come immediately to mind, particularly around physical signs that someone is hurt. But domestic abuse isn't always physical, is it?
No, absolutely right, Miranda. If I sort of go back 20 years when I first started nursing, the term actually used then was domestic violence. And I think what comes to mind is that individual, male or female, who've got an obvious physical injury. What we know now is that it's much more complex than that. Physical violence is part of it, it's just part of the story. And it's much more complex than first realised.
I think the key thing now is that, this broad range of different types of abuse constituting the umbrella of domestic abuse is absolutely being recognised at the highest level. And we've got the introduction this year of the Domestic Abuse Act, which is for the first time is giving statutory definitions of domestic abuse. And the key thing being that also that it doesn't matter whether that behaviour is just a single one-off incident or whether it's a pattern of behaviour. Abuse is abuse, and it's helping to identify that.
By putting out categories out into the wider world and making those known, that must really help victims and victims' families to be able to say, actually, I'm going through that. That's happening to me, or that's happening to a family member, without them previously maybe having put it under the umbrella of abuse.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that think, well, if they're not getting physically hurt, then there's no way that they are in a domestic abuse situation, because that was always the understanding. So it must feel reassuring on one level that actually people will understand that there's so much more to it, and that if they are being financially affected, or if there is that coercive controlling behaviour where individuals might be being isolated by their partners, that actually it's been given a name now, it's acknowledged, and they're able to speak up and talk to people about it. It's given it a name, as you say, and they can identify with that, which is really important.
I don't know about you, but I think there is a bit of a misconception that domestic abuse happens to women in the majority. And I think that is in part true, but evidence does show that significant numbers of men are victims of female perpetrated violence as well. But that issue is underexplored, and the extent and effects of that abuse are quite poorly understood, as I understand it. So what do we need to be aware of then when it comes to gender roles and domestic abuse?
I think it's exactly as you said, really, that there is no one identity or picture of domestic abuse. It's entirely it's incredibly broad. It's across all genders. It's across all age groups. It's across all social, ethnic situations. So there is no one immediate picture that represents domestic abuse. But we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in their lifetime are going to experience the effects of domestic abuse, and that feels really high statistics. And it probably means that we may be infected even if we are not directly victims of domestic abuse. We will know somebody, may come into contact with people through our work or through personal lives or in the workplace who may be affected by domestic abuse. So I think it's really important to not have any preconceptions about what we might expect a victim or a perpetrator to appear like, because there are victims of domestic abuse that are male. There are same-sex relationships where there's domestic abuse. So there's a high incidence of domestic abuse across all gender groups and sexual relationships.
I think what's also important to say is the social representation of that individual. So for some men, it might be really difficult, for example, to say that they're being abused by a woman. It might be that they're 6 foot tall and their partner is 4 foot tall. To have to say, I'm being abused by this person's actually really difficult. And I think that fear of not being believed and the social norms, if you're a male and you talk to your male friends about that, I know there are some males who've had a response where actually it's just a bit of fun. There's no way that they could be abusing you. Look at you, look at them. So that worry about not being believed, and also that perception as a man, what that means in society. So I think that sort of plays into it too.
And domestic abuse is often a hidden problem. It's not something that's often out there in the open. We've talked about physical, sexual violence as being a part of domestic abuse, but actually often those are the incidents that happen when that power and control is lost, and that is essentially what a perpetrator is looking to have with the victim of domestic abuse, is about having power and control, and they'll use all sorts of strategies for that, and that can be manipulated regardless of whether you're a male, female, or however you identify. So actually the tactics that are used are not gender specific. Of course, there may be some aspects of physical intimidation that will depend on the size of the perpetrator, and that may lean more towards a male towards female, but it really we must be really conscious that we cannot have this preconceived idea as to what a victim looks like or a perpetrator looks like, and we need to be curious. And if we're picking up the signs that something doesn't feel right, we mustn't let our own biases influence our decision making. We need to be curious with every case that we think we're coming across, just to confirm, is there something going on and what's happening for that person.
That must be key for clinicians in terms of safeguarding, because if you're going into somebody's home and you see something that doesn't feel right, instantly that phrase, it doesn't feel right, but what if it looks right? What if it looks perfectly normal and actually there's something else going on? You've got to have so many layers to your thinking to be able to spot something like that, I presume.
And often I think relationships where there's domestic abuse, there's often a front, and there's a strong desire to present as a perfect couple. And it might be that actually, as part of that, some of the things that arouse your suspicions is that things just appear too perfect. There may be other red flags that are going on, but it's really, it's thinking about, what is going on. And absolutely, clinicians do need to be professionally curious and sensitively explore things, and when maybe their gut feeling is telling them something different to what they're seeing, exploring that. But it is important to say, when we're exploring that and maybe wanting to ask questions of people who are experiencing domestic abuse, we need to be really cautious and make sure that we're not doing anything that's putting that potential victim at that point at risk of further harm, because we need to just make sure that we're keeping everybody safe.
I think just to add in there also, as Mark has already said, as a safeguarding team, we encourage that professional curiosity. So in every single situation that a clinician might come across, to be professionally curious. And we need to extend that out to other people in the home as well, because we're very aware that if we've got 2 adults that we're working with, we might think that they make decisions to stay with a perpetrator of abuse, for example. But what we need to think about, is there another adult in the home who might be particularly vulnerable? Is there a child in the home who would also be vulnerable? What we know is that children who are witnessing domestic abuse, it's part of the domestic abuse bill that there's that acknowledgement that that is going to have a harmful emotional impact on the child. So we really have to be mindful that we're thinking about the adults perhaps that we're working with, but also thinking that wider context around who else is living in that home. Is there a grandparent who's being cared for, who's got dementia, for example? Is there a vulnerable child? To really explore that, so that we can fully understand risk and impact.
The responsibility to be professionally curious like that is everybody's responsibility. That strapline that safeguarding is everybody's business. So it doesn't matter what band you're in, it doesn't matter what experience you've got. It's asking those questions of people, and that can be really scary. And I think the key thing is not to just ignore it. It may be that you're worried about asking questions because maybe you know what the answer is going to be, or you suspect it's going to be a particular answer. And that may be difficult for you in many ways. It might be that actually that reflects some personal experiences you have, and that might be tricky for yourself to manage. It might be that you just don't know what to do with if you get that answer. That can of worms is opened, and how do I manage that? And the important thing is you don't have to know how to manage it or to deal with it. It's about identifying that there is something going on here, and then it's having a conversation with colleagues, safeguarding team, domestic abuse champions, people who maybe have a bit of more knowledge and a bit more expertise in that area, who can assist you to signpost and to look at how we can begin to address some of the issues if that's a line that the potential victim wants to go down. But the message really is, don't be afraid of asking questions. You don't have to know what to do with that information, but it's really important that we do ask it.
So if I visit a patient and I have a concern, I raise it to you, what happens next? Like how would I know that something was being done about it? Would you come back to me and tell me things, or am I then out of the loop?
So you would be very much in the loop. The role of the safeguarding team and also the domestic abuse champions in relation to a domestic abuse case is, if you as a clinician have identified an issue, you can seek advice and support. So that's where we would come in, or the domestic abuse champion would come in, to have that discussion, think about what are the risks and also what are the actions needed. And then actually it would be the clinician, or it might be the clinician and their manager, so it depends on what their roles are, and also how confident they feel, because it is about, I think with domestic abuse it can feel quite scary and frightening for clinicians. So it's managed in the right way, in the safest way, and from there it will be that clinician who's been empowered to be able to deal with that situation when they're back in that home.
That empowerment is about trying to enable staff to empower their patients and the victims, because it's about signposting people to enable to make decisions for themselves. Because actually, if we've got somebody and we you know, they're an adult and we presume that they have capacity to make decisions, then we very much need to listen to what their wishes are, because somebody may disclose something, or we may have something revealed to us that indicates that domestic abuse is going on, but actually that victim may not want anything to happen. There's many reasons that people will want to stay in a relationship that we may perceive as being abusive, and it's not for us to judge that. It's about signposting as to where people can get support if they make a decision that they do want to move on from that relationship or take action. So there's a phrase that we use a lot in safeguarding around making safeguarding personal, and it's about no decision about me without me. And it's really key that we're involving that person to decide what they want to do with it. And that can sit very uncomfortably for a lot of staff, because actually a person who has the mental capacity to make a decision may make decisions that we think are unwise. But under the principles of the Mental Capacity Act for adults, we would need to respect that and support it and facilitate it.
We talk about relationships, and you mentioned the word couple, Mark, and I'm just interested to know if other relationships come under the domestic abuse umbrella. So like a father to a son, or, you know, is it every relationship in that home, or would it just be a partnership kind of couple relationship?
So it doesn't have to be marriage or a civil partnership. It can absolutely be anybody within that family dynamic, within that environment. So yes, it may be that domestic abuse is experienced by a grandparent towards a grandchild. It might be the other way around. It might be an uncle and aunt. It could be any of those dynamics. It might be that there is no blood relatives within that relationship, that it's a step parent, or there's many different kind of connotations that might account. But ultimately it's about, you know, what is happening for those individuals, what is the power dynamics that's going on, is that consensual, is there you know, evidence of this coercive controlling behavior. So no, it can absolutely affect other people. And we've talked about adults being able to make decisions, but there are certainly some adults who maybe are unable to make decisions because of underlying health conditions that mean that they lack the capacity to make decisions. And in those instances, for adults, we are likely to have a duty of care to report that to social services safeguarding, to our multi-agency safeguarding hub colleagues, the MASH team, because the local authority will hold a responsibility for investigating that safeguarding concern. So for adults who lack the mental capacity and appear to be experiencing abuse, we need to report that. So we would always encourage people to have a conversation with us first in NCH&C safeguarding, but it's likely that those are the types of cases where we may need to refer this on to the safeguarding team, who may or may not get the police involved, but will likely investigate it. And there are similar sorts of decisions to be made when it comes to children.
Yeah, absolutely. So children are also vulnerable, and whether it be that coercive controlling behaviour that they're witnessing or physical violence, we would still need to think about the impact on the child. And again, it could well end up as a safeguarding referral that goes into the Children's Advice and Duty Service in Norfolk to raise those concerns, because again, we have that duty of care to the children to make sure, that they're safe.
I'm just thinking, as you're talking, our teams are potentially integral to somebody's safety, especially given the past 2 years. Because if you're locked down with that family member or that partner, and you're not even allowed to see your extended family, potentially the only person you are seeing is a clinician. The pandemic must have just had such an impact on some victims. I mean, how do you think the pandemic affected people's relationships?
It's probably heightened things for a lot of people. If you are already in a domestic abuse relationship, and then suddenly you're under the same roof 24 hours a day, that is just going to exacerbate what's already going on, isn't it? And just to take your point around the clinicians who are going into the home, they might be, but actually that individual might not be able to say at that point that they're in that kind of relationship and what they're experiencing, because the perpetrator is also in the home. So it's made that reporting to clinicians on that face-to-face sort of level much more complex, much more difficult. And I think, we have had a lot of staff over the pandemic that have raised issues around domestic abuse, but I would say that's increased since lockdown is over rather than when lockdown was ongoing.
Definitely, I think there's a fallout that we're beginning to pick up now as we're beginning to have contact again with people after not. But I think also some of our working methods have changed. There are some things that we've embraced or had to embrace through lockdown in terms of how we work, potentially more telephone conversations with people rather than face-to-face visits, maybe a greater level of use of technology and video conference calls. And one of the things we need to think about when we're having those sorts of conversations is, whose voice are we really hearing? Who is really behind that telephone call? Who's really behind that screen? Is there somebody else who's actually pulling the strings? And are we truly hearing the voice of our patients and potential victims? So it's really important to just think about that. But there are some positive things in terms of how we work and investigating concerns we might have. We can use COVID and pandemic to manipulate situations. So if you work in a clinic space, you may be able to say, actually, you've got suspicions, maybe a couple have come in and there's a perpetrator and abuser. You can use it to your benefit to say, actually, we're trying to limit the number of people we've got coming into the clinic room now. So what I'm going to do is take you in for your appointment, and we can have a conversation afterwards as a group, if there's anything you want to bring up. But it just gives you that opportunity to have a bit of one-on-one with that person and potentially have a conversation with them, ask some questions about whether they feel safe. Is there anything that they're concerned about? Do they feel safe at home, and the relationships that they're in?
Yeah, I never would have thought of that, kind of using it to your advantage to probe a bit more.
A lot of our team meetings and things like that are now done over, Microsoft Teams. So are there any subtle changes, that we've noticed around colleagues? And it maybe they look like they feel a bit uneasy. Maybe they haven't got their camera on. Maybe they're not as vocal as they normally are. And it's those little subtle things sometimes that just, again, make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And you need to listen to that gut feeling. And there's obviously, for managers, it's that responsibility to ask again that curious sort of question around, how are things with you?
It's less obvious signs, isn't it, like you say? And if someone's got their camera off for a long time, it's checking in. And you say managers, and you're right, there is that responsibility for managers, but also, what can we do as colleagues? Like, can we be asking people, are you okay? Should we be?
I think absolutely we should. We talked about that, if we think about it from a safeguarding point of view, safeguarding is everybody's business, whether that's, with the patients you work with, the colleagues you work with, in society, more generally. So I think it's absolutely about asking those questions. And actually at work, the person, if they are experiencing domestic abuse, may well be in an environment where actually they are free of that perpetrator for a period of time. And, it takes sometimes a lot of asking somebody, are they okay, before they actually open up. So it's really important that we do. So I absolutely wouldn't just dismiss things. And I think it's about asking those questions. And again, it's about being brave. It might not feel comfortable. It might not be somebody that you would normally ask those sorts of questions of. But I think it is really important that we do be curious and just check in with people.
And you mentioned previously the domestic abuse champions, and I'm keen to talk about those. So if I had a concern potentially, I don't actually need to say anything. I could come to a domestic abuse champion, because is that what they're there for? Either for someone to come to talk about their own issues, or I guess for a colleague to come to and say, look, I've got a concern. Can you talk me through what I can do or what you can do? So tell me more about the role of the domestic abuse champions.
Absolutely, that's what it is. So these are individuals who have expressed an interest in learning more about domestic abuse. So they've gone off and done another 2 days full of training. And from there, once they've completed their training, the role is then basically on the intranet, their name will be placed as a domestic abuse champion. So, for example, if they wanted to speak to a domestic abuse champion in their area, they'd be able to identify where that individual worked and make contact with them. And that domestic abuse champion would be able to advise them and support them. So whether that be the clinician in their role as clinician, that they're working with a patient where there's concerns around domestic abuse, or it might be them as individuals.
And I'm guessing that's a completely confidential service.
Yes, absolutely. If we were ever concerned that there are others at risk, we may have to act, but it wouldn't be done without the consent of the individual in that first instance. So it's important people realise that they are in control. They're in control of the information that they're sharing with you, and that really the domestic abuse champions are there to support.
And Mark, you've done the training, haven't you? So how do you feel as a domestic abuse champion?
The key thing for the domestic abuse champions is about asking questions. And if people are interested in that, there are no barriers in terms of what your profession is. You don't have to be a clinician. You don't have to have any personal experience of domestic abuse. You really just need to be somebody who would feel comfortable about potentially having some difficult conversations with staff and being able to kind of manage the emotional content of that situation for yourself and the other person, and being able to signpost somebody to resources for people who are experiencing domestic abuse to support them.
I think it's great that the trust offer this, because like you said before, work might be a safe haven for somebody. So if they're coming in, escaping that situation, and they know that there are individuals on their site potentially who they could literally walk up to and say, I need help, rather than having to sift through a Google search, or it be a faceless somebody in a charity. It's a person, potentially they might know them, it might be a friendly face. I mean, that's a great service to be offering.
We would always encourage people, I think, if they are feeling they want to speak to somebody, is certainly speak to somebody that they are potentially familiar with, line managers, domestic abuse champions. But also the beauty of it is that it might be that you feel that actually you want to make contact with somebody who isn't within your place of work, so that you have that level of independence of somebody who will keep that confidential and but is somebody you don't know, and that can feel more comfortable for some people to explore. So this is why we're trying to encourage as many people as we can to become domestic abuse champions, to give that breadth of resources for staff to access in a way that suits them.
As we approach Christmas, the nights are drawing in, and I mean, am I right to think that this change in the weather or even particular events in a calendar could be a trigger for some abusers? I mean, might be a silly question, but is abuse seasonal?
No, domestic abuse is there all of the time, but I think we probably agree that the situation can be exacerbated sometimes by the time of the year, or it might be a specific sporting event, for example. So there's research around when England play a big match, if they lose, that the percentages of domestic abuse instances go up a little bit. And obviously everything that comes with the time of year, like Christmas, we're obviously fast approaching Christmas now. there's often a lot of pressure on families and also individuals. So it could be financial pressure, it could be because the children are off school, and then that just means that you're again all under the same roof. You know, there's pressure that way. So those sorts of things can really exacerbate if you are already in that sort of relationship. It can increase the risk of there being more instances. So it's not seasonal as such, but there are definitely times where you will find that there'll be an increase of instances because of those pressures.
As we mentioned before, those sort of less obvious signs that we should be looking out for, it's around this kind of time that we might want to start really checking in on people.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course that goes all year round, but I think when you've got a period of time like this, it's just good to be mindful that there might be people that are struggling a little bit more than usual. So if you are noticing even small things, it is about that checking in. Are you okay? I've noticed this. Do you feel safe? And I think Mark touched on that earlier. We wouldn't necessarily encourage staff to go out and ask people if they're in domestic abuse relationships, but it's more, are you feeling safe? How is it for you at the moment? To get a real understanding, but a much more sort of gentle opener, really. If individuals don't realise they're in a domestic abuse relationship, they will say to you, no, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm fine. But if you say, are you safe? Are you feeling okay at the moment? You'll get a different response.
That language is so important, isn't it? Because if it's less accusatory that way as well, you're not going in saying, oh, it looks to me like you're in an abusive relationship. You're saying, look, how are you? What's going on? And we know there's fronts that people put up, but I think cracks can show, can't they? And if we're asking the right questions and using the right language, we should hopefully be able to see those.
Absolutely. And you might be a family member who's spending a bit more time than usual because of the Christmas period, for example. And then you might notice, because it's much harder, isn't it, to keep on that front if you're with somebody for a few days than it is for an hour at a time.
To people listening to this podcast who are perhaps thinking it's a heavy subject, don't know what to think at the end of this episode, what are your closing thoughts?
Don't be afraid of it. So it feels like it's a really heavy subject. And obviously the impact on individuals that are going through it is really significant, but don't be afraid of it, because there are a lot of charities out there who are set up to support individuals, that we can signpost to, and the organisation itself, have got very clear processes in place to be able to support our patients, but also to support our staff members. So don't be frightened. There's domestic abuse champions here. The safeguarding team are here. We're always happy to support.
I would absolutely echo the don't be afraid of it from both angles. I think, for staff who may be experiencing domestic abuse themselves, be reassured there's an organisation, we are committed to making sure that we are keeping our staff safe, and there's lots of stuff that we can do to help support staff. I think if people are seeing patients or people that they come into contact as part of their work, being curious, asking those questions, but just remembering not to put themselves, not other people, and the potential victims at greater risk by being curious.
So it's not just the adults, that we might be working with. It's thinking about, is there anyone else, that I know is living there that could also be impacted? So it's thinking about that wider sort of family network.
We may also have, or either come into contact with people who might identify themselves as being perpetrators of abuse and disclose that actually they feel they need some support to try and address that and to help. So I think we need to make sure that we are, if we're being asked for help with that, either as patients or as staff, that we're supported with that. And there are organisations out there, Respect is one of them, and they can help with people who identify that they may be abusers, and that they may be wanting to make changes to prevent them undertaking some of the things that they're doing.
We just instantly go to the victim sort of side and in terms of reporting, but it could be, you're absolutely right, that a perpetrator's thinking, I'm heading down this path and I don't want to, and I need help, and that could open them up to all sorts of judgment.
Absolutely. And I think, if we're thinking of the statistics, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 4 men, behind all that there is an abuser. And so we're talking about abusers, happening quite frequently. So that could absolutely be people within our organisation. It could also be people that we come into contact with. It could be the patients that we see or their family members. So we just need to be aware that some of them may have epiphanies. They may actually be doing things that they feel they're unable to control, and for whatever reason. We need to be non-judgmental about that. And if somebody's asking for help, I think we've got a duty, and many of it as clinicians will have codes of conduct and codes of practice that actually, we need to signpost people in the same way, in a confidential manner, exactly the same as we would support a victim. But that might sit quite difficult in a difficult way for people, and it might not sit comfortably. But it is important to remember and recognise, I think.
I think as well, just to add to that, Mark, that we have had calls into the safeguarding team, haven't we, where clinicians or staff are working with patients, and actually it's the patient who's the perpetrator of the abuse, and it might be that just sort of in passing their partner has said, this is what happens to me, and I think that can also be difficult sometimes for that individual to carry on working. You have to be non-judgmental, of course you do, the care remains the same, doesn't it, regardless. And it is about what support could we signpost this individual to if they were willing, to look at that. So it's that non-judgmental approach is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think around where actually the perpetrator is our patients and we've got victims, often there may be underlying health conditions that people might link to rationalise why that behaviour is there. Dementia as an example. Actually, as a result of that dementia, maybe this person has become disinhibited and lashes out a bit more. And I think it's whether it ultimately gets labelled as domestic abuse or not, there is physical abuse that is happening, and we need to address that. And we can sometimes find the victims say that's their condition, and they may well be right. It's not the person. It's not the person maybe they've known. But things around, we can't use diagnosis as excuses for when it's happening not to take action. But certainly, whilst it is a possibility with dementia, it can be quite rare, and it's a small percentage of people who have dementia or other conditions are violent. But we just need to bear that in mind. We've talked about people who are in abusive relationships, and because they're not experiencing the physical abuse, they don't view it necessarily. He's not abusing me, he doesn't hit me. She doesn't bash me, so I've got no bruises. But likewise, people do rationalise some of that physical abuse, and one of the key things is there an underlying condition that they link to that not being, it depersonalises it, but that person is still at risk.
Domestic abuse isn't always physical, and we've talked about some of the non-physical signs, but what about things like gaslighting? How common is that? What does that look like?
So gaslighting is quite a specific form of abuse. This is where the perpetrator aims to manipulate a victim by psychological means, and so that person begins to doubt their own reality and their memories and their perceptions, and it can make them question their own sanity. And the goal of it is, in terms from the perpetrator's point of view, is about reducing self-esteem and confidence, so that the victim becomes more dependent on the person. And this fits in with that coercive behaviour and controlling behaviour that is really quite prevalent, and is often a feature of lots of people in abusive relationships, where they are unable to make decisions for themselves. And ultimately, gaslighting, coercive and controlling behaviour is about power and control over somebody, and influencing their ability. And they'll use lots of tactics. The coercive and controlling behaviour and gaslighting may be about trying to isolate somebody, get them away from family, so that they can have a greater level of control over them. And this may never bleed or move into physical abuse, but it's something that is really pervasive for people. And to experience that, if you see it on television, in films and television programs, it's a difficult watch for an hour. But what if you're that person and you're experiencing that for 24 hours every day, every week, every month? It's really, really hard and difficult. So it's really important that we do recognise it, and we don't have to, for staff, they don't need to go out and say that's gaslighting, but actually it may just be a sign. If somebody, is talking about, I need to be with this person because my memory, I'm forgetting a lot of things. I can't cope without them. They're my rock, my support. It might be just thinking about what is going on. And if we're thinking of our older population, we may think about that sort of thing as being, well, maybe they do have some underlying cognitive problems, age-associated memory loss. But actually, we need to just think about, is there a more sinister edge to it, and is there manipulation?
And I think it's everything that Mark's just said, but it's remembering with domestic abuse, it's that intimate relationships. It doesn't have to be partners, husbands and wives. It could be children to their parents. So it's looking for those elements in all of those relationships, because it could be happening, just as easily for a parent to a child and an adult child and vice versa. But it's just being able to identify that as part of the coercive sort of controlling behaviour.
Thank you for listening to Take a Moment with NCH&C. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please visit the podcast intranet page to leave a comment and for details of our other episodes. You can also follow NCH&C on all social media channels.